Has China won or lost from the Ukraine war?
To explain the complexity, I will try to answer three questions. The first question will be, what exactly is China's position on the Ukraine war? Second question, how has China lost? Third question, how has China won? And I hope that as I try to answer these questions, you'll begin to understand the complexity of China's position. So let me begin by answering the first question. What exactly is China's position? And here I want to begin with the important word of warning. If you want to understand China's position on the Ukraine war, don't trust the Anglo-Saxon media. Because if you read the Anglo-Saxon media, and I give you a couple of examples like the Economist, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, you'll get a very black and white picture of China's position on the Ukraine war, saying, oh, China is taking Russia's side, and therefore China is wrong, and China is evil, and China should be condemned. Now, of course, that black and white picture is completely wrong, because it is very clear that China has not supported Russia in its invasion of Ukraine in any way. Of course, China hasn't condemned Russia, but then China is not alone there. One of the best friends of the West is the largest democracy in the world, India, and India also actually hasn't condemned Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, because in geopolitics, everything is very complicated. Countries like China and India and South Africa or Brazil have to weigh a lot of considerations before they work out what their positions are. They have their own national interests. And so China has actually been very, very careful about the position it's taken on Ukraine war. It hasn't condemned Russia, but at the same time, it's kept up its ties with Ukraine. And indeed, actually, the Ukrainian government still maintains good relations with China. And Ukraine has always been actually a major trading partner of China, and China is doing its best to keep up its trade with Ukraine. And I suspect quietly behind the scenes, also trying to find ways and means of seeing whether a solution can be found. And of course, you will see more of that in the G20 meeting, which is actually taking place today as we speak, in G20 Foreign Ministers meeting, which is taking place today in Bali. But overall, the key point I want to make is that China could have actually taken a position of fully supporting Russia in this war, but it's been very careful to ensure that it's kept a certain distance from it. And of course, it's true that China's and Russian leaders did say, as you know, in February this year, they met just before the invasion of Ukraine, and they did issue a statement saying there are no limits to the partnership between China and Russia. But that, I think, was referring to the broader relationship. And here, in the broader relationship, it's quite natural for China and Russia to come together because both are under severe pressure from the West, for different reasons, by the way. Because Russia is clearly not seen as a long-term challenge or threat to Western dominance, certainly American dominance. But China is clearly seen as a threat to certainly American dominance. And as you all know, a major geopolitical contest has broken out between United States and China. And of course, if you want to understand the origins, the structural forces that are driving it, what will be the outcome, who will win this US-China contest, I've actually documented all that in my book, Has China Won, which is available. And if you want to know more about that subject, I would suggest you look at that book. And of course, it's because of that larger geopolitical contest with China under pressure from the West that it has kept up its partnership with Russia. But if you read my book, Has China Won, you will also say, you will also see, and this was written 2 years ago, that on the China-Russia relationship, over the long run, they will actually have divergent goals. Because in many ways, even though right now Russia's main focus, main pressure is coming from the West, from Europe, and so on and so forth, in the long run, Russia will worry more about the rise of China. Russia has the longest border with China. And so in the long run, actually, it's conceivable that Russia and Europe may actually come together and work together. So I want to emphasize all this because I began my remarks by saying that this whole geopolitical situation is very complex. And I hope that my remarks so far have brought out and drawn out the complexity of the subject and in many ways differ sharply from the simple black and white perspective that you get from the Anglo-Saxon media, which frankly is downright wrong. So if you see an article from The Economist or from the New York Times on China and Russia, be very wary. Don't trust them because they have an agenda in what they're writing and they're not being fair and accurate and objective in their reporting on the subject. And you also see this comes out as I now talk about the second and third questions. The second question I want to answer, of course, is has China lost? And here I want to say very categorically that initially, in the initial phase after the Ukraine war, it's very clear that China has lost in the short term, and lost in actually 4 different ways. The first way in which China has lost is that, the year 2022 is actually a very important year in China's political transition. There'll be a very important party congress in October, November this year, and the likelihood is that President Xi Jinping will get a 3rd term, and that's, as you know, unprecedented in recent times, and therefore that's a major political transition that's going to take place in China in October, November. And what President Xi wanted was a year of calm and stability in 2022. Instead, he's had to deal with 2, in a sense, major, I would call them almost like monsters of challenges. First is managing the exit out of the zero COVID policy, which is going to be a big challenge for China. And second, handling the ramifications of the Ukraine war. So in a year in which China wanted calm, is getting a tremendous amount of turbulence. And therefore, in that sense, the Ukraine war has been, a challenge for China. And the second way in which China has lost out is that, as you know, as I explained, since both China and Russia are under pressure, they have developed a partnership, which is a natural thing to fend off the geopolitical pressures, the common geopolitical pressures that they feel. And it would be clearly in China's interest to see its partner, Russia, strengthen. Instead, and this is not a secret, Russia clearly has been weakened by the Ukraine war. We all know that when President Putin launched his invasion on February 24th, especially when he sent his tanks heading straight towards the capital, Kiev, I think he thought that I'm just going to launch a blitzkrieg operation, take over the capital city. The people of Ukraine will welcome the Russian troops and we will have a quick victory. I mean, he never said that that was his expectation, but that's what the behavior seemed to show. And as you know, it didn't work out. In fact, phase 1 of the Russian operation was a disaster, a real magnificent disaster. And at the end of the day, there was a rather ignominious retreat of the Russian tanks away from the capital city. And of course, there was a lot of celebration, exaltation in the West about this Russian defeat. And they thought, well, Ukraine's going to win the war. But I think the West, once again, has seriously underestimated Russian resolve. And clearly, the Russians are now going to carry on in an operation which I call a slow grinding operation to increase their space in Ukraine. And here it is conceivable that Russia can win in the long run. You'll have to wait and see. But in any case, clearly the war in Ukraine has proven to be a bigger challenge for Russia than Russia anticipated. Western sanctions have hit Russia. So Russia has been weakened, and with the weakening of Russia, this clearly is a setback for China too. That's the second way in which China has been negatively affected. The third way in which China has been negatively affected is that in trying to manage its rise, China has realized long time ago, actually, and if you look at my book, Has China Won, I say even over 20 years ago, China anticipated a kind of some kind of American containment policy on China. And to try and ward off that containment policy, China did many things. But one of China's hopes was to try and deal with the United States and Europe as two separate entities with separate interests, and trying to make sure that the two didn't unite themselves against China. And for a long time, that was true. Europe actually had an independent policy towards China. In some areas, they agreed with the United States, but in other areas, for example, especially in trade, they stepped up their trade and connections with China. And China was more or less dealing with the United States and Europe separately, which is, of course, in China's interest. But then one of the most striking outcomes of the Ukraine war has been this remarkable coming together of the United States and Europe in a tremendous revitalization of Western solidarity. And now China has to deal with a strong united West rather than a divided West between the United States and Europe. And that is geopolitically, frankly, more uncomfortable for China. And as you know, the latest meeting between the European leaders and Chinese leaders proved to be difficult and fractious because the Europeans took the view that China should automatically support the European position on the Ukraine war, which of course was very unrealistic. So therefore, this revitalization of Western solidarity is also a setback for China. Of course, you have to wait and see how long this Western solidarity lasts, but we can talk about that later. And in the fourth way in which China has lost out from the Ukraine war is that for a long time, China thought that it had this incredible assets, its total reserves, which were about $3.2 trillion. Today, it's about $3 trillion of foreign reserves, which they saw as assets that they could use to protect China. And lo and behold, they were absolutely shocked to see how half of Russia's central bank reserves, out of 680 billion, I think 340 billion were seized by the West and frozen by the West. So clearly, now China sees that what is foreign reserves, which it saw as assets, could turn into liabilities if it could just be frozen overnight by the West and Western banks and so on and so forth. So this clearly has become a strategic, therefore, setback for China. And they are clearly now China must be thinking very hard, how do I protect myself from future Western sanctions, and how do I protect my reserves, and so on and so forth. So you can see on all these counts that I mentioned, the stability that President Xi wanted this year, the partnership with Russia, the unification of the West, and the vulnerability of the foreign assets that China has. In all these areas, China has lost out from the Ukraine war. So now then, therefore, let me turn to the next question, which is how has China won from the Ukraine war? And here it's, while in the initial phase, as I said, China has lost out. As this war is dragging out, and nobody, by the way, still knows what the final outcome is going to be, we are beginning to see the emergence of new trends that could work in the favor of China. So, for example, I mentioned there has been revitalization of Western solidarity, and up to now, the West has been completely united on the Ukraine war. But it is conceivable that as the war drags on, and as the costs increase, especially for the domestic populations, in United States and in Europe, you will find that there might be a domestic backlash in both these countries against the continuation of the war. And as you know, gasoline prices in the US have gone up very, very sharply, and that is actually putting a lot of pressure on the administration of President Joe Biden. And as you know, President Joe Biden and his Democratic Party are very much focused on the midterm elections in November. And if inflation continues to rise, and if things get very difficult for the middle classes in America, there could be a political backlash against President Joe Biden, and therefore there could be some pressures to find some kind of a solution in Ukraine, instead of taking the very hardline position that the United States has taken on the Ukraine war. In the same way, it's also possible that you might get a summer of unrest in many European countries if inflation rises and if energy prices remain very high. And certainly even a country like France, which has been quite stable, as you saw in the last elections, there was while President Macron did get re-elected as president, he lost the, what you call the Legislative Assembly elections, and though he has to deal with a much more difficult domestic environment. So even in Europe, which today seems very strong and united on the Ukraine war, there might be a certain degree of exhaustion over it, and therefore reconsideration of defense, and therefore perhaps the strong Western resolve that you have seen so far may weaken in the weeks and months to come, and therefore that would change balance between the West and China. And at the same time, there's one statistic which I want you to remember, is very important statistic, which is that only 12% of the world's population lives in the West. 88% lives outside the West. And certainly initially, when the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, it shocked the world, and clearly you saw that over 140 states, I think, condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine in the UN General Assembly vote. So you got the sense that the West and the rest were united in their approach towards the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But again, over time, you see that even though the West has tried to apply very strong sanctions on Russia, the sanctions have been quite brutal, in some ways quite effective. You actually discover that if you look at the population of the world, the percentage of the world's population in the countries that have actually imposed sanctions on Russia is only like 14 or 16% of the world's population. And 84 to 85% of the world's population have not imposed sanctions on Russia, and in fact are now saying very clearly to the West, this war in Ukraine is not just damaging the people on Ukraine. The people of Ukraine are clearly suffering, and we should support the people of Ukraine in their suffering in this war. But the rest of the world is also suffering. The war in Ukraine, as I suggested earlier, has increased global inflation, increased global energy prices, increased food prices, and therefore hundreds of millions of people in many third world countries are actually going to go hungry as a result of the Ukraine war. And the sheer indifference of the West to the pain and suffering of the poor in third world countries is becoming now very clear and palpable, and therefore leading in some ways to a backlash against the West on the Ukraine issue. And in that sense, in some ways, China's position, as I indicated earlier, is more in tune with the position of most third world countries. And actually, China, as you know, has tried to be helpful to many of them in different ways. So paradoxically, what initially seemed to be, in a sense, a united global response against the Russian invasion of Ukraine now seems very much as a Western response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with very little support from the majority of the countries in the 88% of the world's population who live outside the West. So in that sense, it's become very much a shift away from the global united response. And this is also shown in the positions that are taken by the larger countries in the third world. And certainly, and you will see this play out, by the way, both in the G20 foreign ministers meeting taking place today, that more and more major third world countries like India, like Indonesia, like Brazil, like South Africa, saying, hey, we shouldn't just focus on the war in Ukraine. We should focus on ending the war in Ukraine, working for a ceasefire, and trying to find peace in Ukraine, because the problems in Ukraine are disrupting lives, not just in Ukraine, but disrupting lives all over the world. And just yesterday, I got a WhatsApp message from a senior Indonesian diplomat in Bali saying that it's very clear that the majority of the G20 countries are speaking out to say, hey, let's work harder for peace in Ukraine. So I think the West, therefore, I think will begin to find that initially what they thought was them working with the rest of the world on the subject, they find that the rest of the world is now moving away from them. And if the West wants to understand this better, I think what they should do is to study very carefully a country that the West is very comfortable with now, and actually in many ways, sometimes many in the West see as now a new ally of the West. And of course, that country is India. India is the world's largest democracy. So when the West says that, hey, this is as you know, has been said many times by the West, this is a contest between democracies and autocracies. And if they really believe that, then they should ask themselves the question, what is the position of the world's largest democracy, which is India? Now, India clearly didn't approve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But as I said at the very beginning of my remarks, India also didn't condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And even if you want to understand why, there are actually very sound historical reasons why India hasn't condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. For a start, this is a fact. India still gets most of its arms from Russia. This is a legacy going back to the days of the old Soviet Union, when actually, as you know, the United States actually was the country that was applying pressure on India, certainly after India invaded East Pakistan to liberate the people of East Pakistan, which later became the state of Bangladesh. And at that time, as you all know, the United States actually sent an aircraft carrier. Both President Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger sent an aircraft carrier into the Bay of Bengal to threaten India. And from those days, India switched to move closer to Moscow and bought most of its arms from Moscow, and still continues to do so today. So that's one reason why India obviously have wanted to maintain its close ties with Russia. And equally importantly, and I say this as someone who was ambassador to the UN for over 10 years, the most powerful international body in the world is the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council is the only body in the world that can impose mandatory sanctions on all countries in the world. So when India was having problems with its neighbors, and India wanted one permanent member of the UN Security Council to support it. And as you know, there are 5 permanent members in the UN Security Council: United States, China, UK, France, and Russia. The only permanent member that has always been consistently sympathetic to India's position, and in fact vetoed any measures that could damage India, that country was Russia. So there is a very deep well of trust within India towards Russia, which is not going to be removed by the Ukraine war, and which also explains why India is taking a very careful, independent position on the Ukraine war. So here, if the West wants to understand what is China's position on the Ukraine war, actually, even though the interests of China and India are different in many ways, in many areas, and of course, you also know there is some rivalry between China and India in many significant areas. Despite all that, when it comes to the Ukraine war, there's a remarkable coincidence of views between China and India on the Ukraine war. And so, therefore, if the West is trying to understand China's position, it's got to understand that China is not isolated in its position on the Ukraine war. In some ways, China's position is actually more in harmony with the position of most countries in the world than that of the West towards the Ukraine war. So I hope that in all my remarks today, what I have done is to bring out the complexity of the subject, and I hope that will enable you to have a better understanding of one of the most difficult and problematic issues of our time.